So, much of today's speech is going to be an update of some work that was performed in 2019. So had the pleasure to work with many of you in the League of Women Voters here, including Dr. Levito, Mary, and Megan. So in 2019, in anticipation of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, we did research here on women from Ashtabula County that played huge roles in the suffrage movement. And Dr. Levito and I, we were researching someone from her alma mater, Edinburgh, who was Mary Doe. We talk about a tough person here from which to do research on with respect to that name, but some just really just amazing people who we will discuss, and a little bit of an update. And our group is going to have to get together at some point in the future because there's future work that can be done and new persons that we're finding here that help to expand suffrage around the nation. So really an incredible story. So I'm going to start here with a quote from Abigail Adams, and I'll make the connection here with Massachusetts and Boston Society. I always love this quote, though, from Abigail Adams, as John is going to Philadelphia to craft the Declaration of Independence or help with that process. She says, don't forget the ladies. Don't forget the ladies. And I love this end of this quote saying that we will turn to rebellion and not hold ourselves bound to any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So that sort of familiar battle cry of no taxation without representation. So when Abigail Adams said that, hey, we're going to follow no law that we disagree with, I want to talk about the women's suffrage movement and the Underground Railroad. And this is a map that was created by Professor Cbert at the end of the 19th century, showing known routes on the Underground Railroad. And so when we talk about the importance of Ohio, when we look at where the majority of these Underground Railroad stations were at, we're talking Ohio, Ohio, Ohio. And if you look here at the point here of what is now West Virginia, part of Virginia at the time, what's the shortest distance for freedom seekers to make it to freedom? Up from what's current day Route 45. So from Salem to Warren, Ohio, through Austinburg, Ashtabula, and then boarding ships to go to Port Burwell, Port Stanley in that straight line, or off to Buffalo, St. Catharines, or over to Oberlin, Sandusky, or Western Ontario, or Fort Malden, or Amherstburg. So what role did women play in the Underground Railroad? And of course, when we tell the story of the Underground Railroad, it happens to always seem to be told on a story of white male privilege. I always love how the Hubbard House is referred to as the Colonel William Hubbard Underground Railroad Station. And do you think Catherine had anything to do with it? And I think we have our answers from some of the work here in the Cbert collection. And I love this quote from a Mrs. P.B. Minor. So she talks with Dr. Cbert, and he says, what was your connection to the Underground Railroad? And her response is kind of goofing with us here. My connection with the Underground Railroad, I simply received the freedom seekers. I kept them carefully secreted. I fed them, I clothed them, I waited on them. I gave them whatever aid and sympathy that I could. But other than that, I didn't do much, other than the whole secreting, part of it. So kind of funny here with respect to that. But it goes even further. And this is sort of unknown stories here of what women played on the Underground Railroad. So here we have a Mary Bushnell and a Mary Sutcliffe, who were actually literally riding the carriages or with the horses here, with the carriages, bringing freedom seekers up north from the Warren area up to Ashtabula Harbor. And this gives a very interesting notification for why that was, because ladies, I hate to say this here, start of our nation, could you own property? We know that that's not the case, right? So what was the status of women at that time? And there was an advantage here for purposes of being participants on the Underground Railroad, because what were the fines under the 1793 so-called Fugitive Slave Act? $1,000 fine for each freedom seeker that you helped. In 1850, that law was strengthened to provide 6 months in jail and $1,000 fine for each person that you helped. So you see here at this end of this quote here about why did we have the young women drive those horses and bring freedom seekers up north rather than their brothers? Because they had no money and they couldn't face any kind of damages here with respect to violating the federal fugitive slave law. So again, it's the guys who get all the credit, but who's the one who's doing all the work? Let's talk about Betsy McColl's. So Betsy McColl's house is on that Warren Ashtabula turnpike here. So we mentioned about present day 45 being the route that freedom seekers would take on their way up north. And that's where Betsy's house is located at, 30 miles as the crow flies from the city of Warren. And she would see freedom seekers that would have these signs of abuse. And she would see situations where you had families that were being ripped apart. And this was something that caused her to be part of the Underground Railroad. So here's a picture of her house, and I have here a recent photograph that was taken the past 30 days of a group from Ashtabula County leadership that took a tour of the house. And this is a true time machine. If you ever have a chance to take a tour here of this house, the front of the house is kept exactly as it was when Betsy McColl died in 1876. As part of her will, she told her family to not disturb the house. The family still owns Betsy's house. So it is an absolute time machine. So here's a picture of Betsy. This again comes from Ginny Seifert, a relative here of Betsy McColl's. So she's a graduate of Oberlin College, the first university to admit African Americans and women. We often look and talk about the sister schools out east as being the first schools to allow women to attend. Not true. It's out here in the Western Reserve. You have Oberlin College that would admit women as early as 1833, and same with African Americans. So Betsy McColl wants to be a part of the Ashtabula Anti-Slavery Society. And ladies, just as we said that you couldn't own property, us guys here, white male privilege, we'd allow you to attend meetings of the Ashtabula Anti-Slavery Society, but we would really prefer if you kind of sat on the side and not speak. And what we would like you to do, though, here is to do some fundraising for us, maybe have bake sales, do quilting, do knitting, from which to raise money here for the cause. And Betsy McColl, this Oberlin trained graduate, comes up and says, I'd like to speak on the most important topic of the day. And she was essentially told, you can't do that. So undaunted, she creates the Female Anti-Slavery Society for Ashtabula County. And on the left here, we have the preamble to that society. It was created in 1835. And on the right is a Garrison publication that shows how many members there were of this club and when it was formed. So here you see Ashtabula County, female, who's the recording secretary, Betsy McColl, created in September of 1835, 224 members. This was an organization that dwarfed the male society. And you can notice that here the societies in Ashtabula County didn't even put their total numbers of how many members that they had. For those of you that are doing research on the Underground Railroad, I actually have a listing of those women who were part of that society, those initial 224 members. And yes, Catherine Hubbard was one of the society's members. So what did Betsy say as she was creating this Ashtabula County Female Anti-Slavery Society? And she was asking the group, what should our role as women be in society and on the Underground Railroad? So I'm not going to ask you to read this. So I'm just going to kind of, I've typed this out with the important parts here, or some of the important parts here. But the question comes again, how shall our influence be felt? We are not strangers to the public sentiment which says, let women's influence be felt indirectly. And then she goes on and says, the cause which demands our efforts demands the energies of rational beings. As such, we pledge the energy and sympathy of the soul exhibited in direct action. In accordance with this, our soul has been formed, our object of which is to raise funds. It's not only to raise funds, but she says that this is far, very far from being the primary object. So again, the male society wanted the women to sit on the side, raise money for them. And here she's going off right in 1835 and saying, well, raising money is important. It's far, very far. And those are her underlines on those words as far as what their main purpose is. So Betsy in the 1840s is a principal of the Grand River Institute. Grand River Institute here in Ashtabula County. It would train African-American students. It would train women. She was sought after to teach in school districts across Ohio, and she was paid on an equal basis as her male counterparts. So she was a true force of nature, and you know, she demanded it. You know, hey, I'm just as good as any guy here in this job, and by goodness, you're going to pay me on an equal basis. And she became the first woman school superintendent in the city of Painesville. In the mid-1840s, she fought to repeal Ohio's black codes that were adopted a year after Ohio became a state. We always say when talking about freedom seekers and the Civil War that Ohio was a free state. But one of the first enactments that Ohio made were rules that said that if you were African American and you moved into the state of Ohio, you had to register with your county officials, and you also had to post a $500 bond. So while we consider ourselves to be a free state here at this time, it wasn't as if we put out a welcome mat for freedom seekers to actually settle here in Ohio. And Betsy literally was on the front lines to have the legislature repeal those laws. She also leads the first women's rights convention west of the Appalachian Mountains. We know this. This occurred in 1850 in Salem, Ohio. And she helped to organize the Women's Rights Convention in 1851 in Akron, Ohio. And that convention in Akron is where Sojourner Truth gave her very famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech. So when we're talking about the suffrage movement, and when we're talking about who was first, one of the things that I love about our story here in Northeast Ohio is that we were very inclusive. We're very inclusive here in the story here, from which to talk about universal rights and universal suffrage to all people. And Sojourner Truth gives this speech where she says, hey, I know that we're talking about giving women up north rights here, and we're talking about giving African Americans rights down south. But she goes, what about me? What about me who lost my children that were taken away from me? Me who faced the lashing. Ain't I a woman? Aren't I entitled to have the right to vote? So again, I love how when Betsy McColl is setting forth these conventions, it's very inclusive. I think it's a great story that we have to tell. Part of the criticism of the Seneca Falls movement here is, was it as inclusive? Or did they sort of forget about African American women and their attempts to obtain suffrage for themselves? Not our story. And I think it's something we should be quite proud of. If Betsy McColl had done nothing else but serve as president of the 1850 National Women's Rights Convention and helped to organize the 1851 convention, I would think that she would be known more on a national stage, but she's not. Maybe we'll talk about that, why that may be the case. But she is rumored to have been part of a women's suffrage convention that occurred at the Jefferson Congregational Church in 1844, which would be a full 4 years before Seneca Falls. So is that possible? So there's this rock in front of the Congregational Church. I have a group of Lake Erie College students here that I gave a tour of pre-COVID. And there's this rock that says that the first women's suffrage convention was held here at this church in 1844. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit here, and I'm going to share sources, and I'm hoping we're going to grow this further. I think we can make the case here that we did hold the first women's suffrage convention. I don't think it was in 1844, but we'll discuss that further. So I know this can be hard to read, and I apologize. But I found out in taking a tour of the Kohls home, I found some sheet music that was signed by Abby Kelly Foster, and it was dated February of 1846. And so that had me searching through Abby Kelly Foster's letters. And in there, I find this letter that she wrote to her friend, Mrs. Chapman, while she was visiting Cleveland, Ohio. And Maria Chapman is saying, you're wasting your time out in Ohio, Northeast Ohio. You should have spent your time in New York City. And Abby Kelly Foster writes back and says, no, Ohio is to the west what Massachusetts is to the east with respect to influence. And she singles out Betsy McColl as being the leading figure here, the leading figure in Ohio here from which to organize folks towards the cause. So you see this, she says, no woman on the reserve has half of her influence. So it gives you some idea of how important Betsy McColl was looked at from a national perspective. So I believe that it was in 1846, not 1844, that it was the time that Betsy McColl called for a women's suffrage convention in Jefferson. So we're going to deal with this article that can be found in the Anti-Slavery Bugle in July of 1846. And you see that she's calling for a meeting of which we're going to conduct a fair. Now, she doesn't call it a convention, she doesn't call it a meeting, but she says, hey, we're going to get together in a few weeks and we're going to have a fair. So I don't expect you to be able to read the Anti-Slavery Bugle that was in September that advertised this fair, but I'm just going to read a portion here of this because this is one of those things that when you read it, I love Betsy. I'm just going to tell you out front, I just love her. And so here's what she says here. She's calling all friends of the slave from every persuasion. You're invited to attend a meeting in Jefferson. Those who think that our movement of the professed friend of the slave only rivets his chains, come so that you may be confirmed. Those who blush for women, that she is thus out of her sphere, come and see how she looks, that you may blush the more, for the deeper the tinge, the more youthful the appearance, hence the greater verdure. Those who think nothing is done, come see the nothing. Those who think a little, come and see how little. Those who think much is accomplished, come and see, great is the work. Those whose superior wisdom looks upon us with contempt, come and see our folly. The contrast will enable you to appreciate even more highly your own superiority. Those who sympathize with us, come, that you may test for yourselves whether or not we are worthy of sympathy. Those who condemn, come and see that you may do it intelligently. This is interesting, this next line, because Abby Kelly was again calling for universal rights. So she goes, those that call us Abby Kellyites, do just come and see what a company of such ites will do. Only think of it. If only one creates such a stir in community, what will a whole company do? Don't lose the sight. Come and see. Those who call us Garrisonians, take your shield in hand, carefully peep over or under it. See how such ons look. Those who call us the Liberty Party, buckle on the whole political armor. Come and stand your ground manfully. Use your own eyes and ears. Don't borrow your neighbors. Exercise your own judgment. Don't borrow this essential to maturity of character from your neighbor. Whatever your predictions, you will probably find what you expect and wish to find. Therefore, we promise you will be gratified. Better times are coming. I love this. I mean, I absolutely love this statement. And I had a discussion with Dr. Levito yesterday where she talked about what men can say and get away with, and what women can say and maybe not get away with. And I mean, certainly, I think we would say if it was a guy who was saying this, boy, what guts, what intestinal fortitude. I think at best we would say here for a woman making this statement, especially in 1846, what moxie, what chutzpah, which might have a little bit of a negative connotation, or would she be called something even worse than that? And I love this. I love this statement here. Come one, come all, see what we're doing. So after that convention occurs, so this is again in 1846, in November of 1846, she is talking, and this is something that is new. This is something I just found out during COVID, is that there's mention here of this publication called The Plea for the Oppressed and the Enslaved. So we know who the enslaved are, who is the plea for the oppressed. And you can see that what it is that she's going to come up with some papers on behalf of the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society of Ashtabula County, and it's going to be devoted to the abolition of the Black codes. So we previously had talked about that. So I had found here over this past year, what was this plea for the oppressed and of the enslaved? And the American Antiquarian Society actually happens to have volume 3 of this. So we know there's another first volume and a second volume. And this is attributed to Betsy McColl and Abigail Foster. They're the ones that wrote this. And it was published by Jane Elizabeth. She was called by our friends Lizzie Hitchcock Jones, who was also the one who published and edited the Anti-Slavery Bugle. If we're going to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, that Ashtabula County held the first women's suffrage convention, this is the triumvirate that did this, because it was Lizzie Jones who was the one who came up with this idea here of we need to have a call for universal suffrage, for human rights. So think about this. This is a common phrase that we use here today, that women's rights are equated to human rights. And this is what the focus was on here, not necessarily women's rights here, but human rights that would include universal suffrage. And so I asked that when we talk about that call for human rights, and does it sound familiar? And where does the League of Women Voters fit in here with that discussion? So immediately after 1846 and 1847, there was the Western tour that was done of the of the anti-slavery, the National Anti-Slavery Society. So William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass come to our area. Where's their first stop? You guessed it, they went to New Lyme in Ashtabula County, Ohio, but they stayed with Betsy McColl. And when we talk about why Betsy may not be known, I wonder if there's a tinge here of what's going on here. So they talk about this great event at New Lyme, how after it left off here, people were going from miles away, as far away as 300 miles away from New Lyme to come to this great event. And afterwards, after we left New Lyme, where did we go? We went to Austinburg and we had supper at Cornelia and Betsy Kohls' brother's house, so where Betsy and her sister Cornelia were at. And it says here, oh, don't we love this? We always refer to young ladies as the girls, right? The girls. So the girls arrived with Douglass soon after I did. And then Garrison tells his wife, I left after we had dinner and we did some singing. I left and stayed in Painesville. Oh, but Douglass spent the night. Oh, a little scandalous, maybe. And then he says later on at the end of the Western tour, I'll kind of go to this bottom of this. He goes to Salem. He stays with Benjamin and Elizabeth Jones. And lo and behold, the Kohls are there again. So they are there to greet Douglass and Garrison. And as they leave from their Western tour, the Kohls family is also there as well. And when Garrison was in Oberlin, he meets with Miss Lucy Stone. And there's a mention here made of how Lucy Stone is seeking women's rights. So let's talk about Lucy Stone. So we're again talking about someone who was educated here at Oberlin. And I want to talk again about that 1850 convention. Lucy Stone is a superstar here in the women's suffrage. She definitely helped to organize what's considered here the second, if not the first, women's suffrage convention in Worcester, Massachusetts in the fall of 1850. So I told you about this convention that was held in Ohio, in Salem, in the spring of 1850. This is forgotten in the history books. No one talks about this convention. And in fact, Lucy Stone, her argument for their being first, Boston Society being first above Seneca Falls, is that it was a national convention, whereas the events at Seneca Falls were more regional, just in New York and Seneca Falls. So here's Lucy Stone, who writes a letter of support of what the women were doing in Salem. And she says, Massachusetts ought to be taking the lead in the work you are now doing. But if she chooses to linger, let her young sister of the West set her a worthy example. Pretty cool. I think, pretty cool here, even when we look at that 1850 Salem Women's Suffrage Convention, if it didn't even happen here before. So let's talk more about Lucy Stone. In 1869, she starts the American Woman Suffrage Association. It was formed in Boston. They held their first convention in Cleveland. There was a competing organization started the same year, the National Woman Suffrage Association, formed in 1869 in New York City. The two organizations combined in 1890 as the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Talk a little bit here about the lasting impact of Betsy McColl, a young John Allen Campbell. He grew up, born and raised in Salem, Ohio. He snuck into that 1850 Salem convention, and he heard how well-spoken the women were and the arguments that they made. And he said, if I'm ever in a position to be able to change that, I will. He happens to become the territorial governor here of the state of Wyoming. And in 1869, Wyoming is the first state that grants women suffrage. And it was John Allen Campbell who made that happen. He was actually bribed $2,000 not to do it. And he said, I'm going to do the right thing here for the women and give the women of Wyoming the right to vote. During the Civil War, the suffrage fight kind of takes a little bit of a hiatus. And I'm going to bring us here briefly here to South Newbury and Ruth Munn. Mr. Munn passed away. Ruth found herself in a position from which to be having to pay taxes, property taxes on her own, no taxation without representation. So she creates the South Newbury Suffrage and Dress Reform Club. She and a group of other women here from South Newbury voted in 1871. Their votes didn't make it into Columbus, so they didn't get charged with the crime. But this was a full year before Susan B. Anthony was more famously arrested for attempting to vote. It's a picture of the South Newbury Union Chapel. I want to point out a couple of people here in this photo. This is Frances Jennings' casement. This is Harriet Taylor Upton. So we'll talk about those two people in a little bit. Frances Jennings' casement, this is her with Jack Casement, who was a Civil War general called Black Jack Casement. He and his brother Daniel helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Very principally involved here in that. Frances Jennings' casement worked to restart the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association, attempted to open up Western Reserve College to women, and worked on the process in 1893, petition process, to allow women to vote and to serve at our local school boards. So she's a very important figure here in the Painesville area. The Sidley property in Painesville, you probably have seen this building here. That was called Jennings Place, and that's where they resided. Wanted to talk here briefly here about Harriet Taylor Upton and Elizabeth J. Hauser. At the start of the 20th century, the National American Woman Suffrage Association was in deep financial trouble. Susan B. Anthony kind of stepped aside, and she wanted to move the headquarters from New York City, where it was very expensive to operate, and asked Harriet Taylor Upton if she would move headquarters over to Warren, Ohio, from which to save expenses. Harriet Taylor Upton said, I'll do that, but I want to have as Elizabeth J. Hauser as being, the press secretary. And they agreed. Harriet Taylor Upton had to take a $1,000 loan. She took it from Mary Anthony, Susan B. Anthony's sister, and a $1,000 loan. And she always had it framed and up at her home as a reminder of her that it's much easier to borrow money than to pay it back. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, this is the Upton House. This is Harriet's house. And they housed the National American Women's Suffrage Association from 1903 to 1909, roughly, here at the at the Trumbull County Courthouse. So they had space on the first floor from which to conduct operations. And during Upton and Hauser's work, the organization increased its membership, increased the pure number of materials that they were producing, and greatly enhanced the financial aspect of that organization. And again, this is probably 30 miles down the road on Route 45 from Betsy McColl's home. I want to talk about Dr. Mary Miller Battles. So this is probably where a situation where Megan may want to come in and say a few words. But she graduated from the Grand River Institute. and the University of Michigan, earning her MD in 1888. She was a well-respected physician and surgeon in our area, and she was a founding member of the Women's Club of Ashtabula County, our local Zonta Club, and president of your League of Women's Voters. She unfortunately died in 1927, and I had no idea about Dr. Battles until I was asked to give a speech at the Women's Club of Ashtabula County in March of 2020, and they happened to have all their records. And here it is, they're giving this this memoir in honor of their lost comrade and talking about the things that she was involved with here, with the Ashtabula Women's Club, with the County Red Cross, first president of the Women's Hospital Auxiliary, League of Women Voters, charter member of the Ashtabula Fortnightly Club, and also of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and also the charter member or creator president of our local Zonta Club. Had a heck of a time trying to find a picture of Dr. Battles. I have to give Warren Dillaway a thank you here on this. He found a thumbnail picture of Dr. Battles in an advertisement talking about local businesses. And this next photograph comes from the Bentley Museum from the University of Michigan. When she went to medical school, they of course had to separate the men and the women, and they were referred to as hen medics. When she graduated from medical school, she had to work with some of her fellow graduates in creating a hospital for women and children in the Detroit area. She became, this early surgeon here in Ashtabula City, and her specialty was cataract surgery, which if you think about doing that at the start of the 20th century, pretty remarkable. So talking a little bit here about law and medicine in 1910, only under 600 female attorneys. By way of comparisons, there were more female doctors at the time of 1910. So this is where I want to talk here about Florence Allen, and I may be running a little bit time, so I'll go quickly here through this. Here's Judge Allen with her parents, Clarence Amir Allen and Corinne Allen. And I'll also show you, this is her eldest sister, Esther, which we'll see her in a later photograph. Her grandfather was Jacob Tuckerman, who was a longtime principal of the Grand River Institute. In the early 1880s, he was convinced to move to the new Lyme Institute. And he attended Oberlin College with Lucy Stone, and he lived near and knew Betsy McColl. He called himself a feminist based on those relationships here with Betsy McColl and with Lucy Stone. This is the picture of the new Lyme Institute. It was called the College on the Hill. Kent State University, before Milton Kent offered the land and money for Kent State University in 1910, when they were creating two normal colleges up north. The new Lyme Institute was going to be, Kent, before Milton Kent came up with the money. But a very well-respected school. Both Grand River Institute and New Lyme Institute had fantastic reputations. So when it came time for the Tuckerman and Allen families to go to school, they went to the New Lyme Institute. Here's Judge Allen right here. We have Esther over here. This is Corinne standing over here. The house still stands on Brownville Road, barely, but you can see some of the same architectural details in the house. She graduates in 1896 from the New Lyme Institute. This is Judge Allen. This is Edith Root Morrison of MFG fame. Edith Ruth Morrison was the recording secretary for the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association. Judge Allen goes to Western Reserve College for her undergraduate degree, gets her master's degree, attempts to go to their law school. And here's a letter from the president here of Western Reserve College that says, hey, thank you again for that list of girls that are interested in going to our professional schools here at Western Reserve College. But he's sort of like, hey, sorry, I talked with the presidents of the law school and the medical school, and the concern is here is, where will the ladies go to the bathroom? I'm not kidding you, that's what this letter says, okay? Unbelievable. To Dr. Thwing's credit, he did allow Judge Allen to use the Harkness Chapel. This had newly been built in the start of the 20th century, from which to organize the women, from which to open up eventually Western Reserve College to women. She also took up the fight for suffrage. So here's the headquarters of the women's suffrage in Cleveland. And here, who is holding the banner for women's suffrage? That's Judge Allen. One of the first presidents here of the League of Women Voters was Belle Sherwin. This is Belle Sherwin over here. And notice how most of the women have turned their backs on this photograph. So this was at a time frame at photography where you had to sit very still for the photograph to be taken. And persons who were present at this meeting said that the women turned their backs, that they didn't necessarily want to be part of this. And Belle Sherwin said that she really didn't want to be a part of the movement, but that she was shamed into it by Elizabeth J. Hauser. So again, that little connection here between Warren and Ashtabula County. But here you see front and center who's holding the flag for votes for women, the future Judge Allen. This is a parade that occurred in Columbus in 1912, largest parade of its time in Columbus at that time. And I also want to go up to this picture here again here when we talk about the women's suffrage headquarters. This originally said the Women's Suffrage Party. They ended up changing that because every day they would have some guy who would come in and say, "Hey ladies, where's the party?" So they had to change the sign here to say Women's Suffrage Headquarters. But again, she's here fighting for that right to vote. So 1920 comes up here. Tennessee is the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment. It occurs by one vote, 50-49. There's a story of Harry Byrne, a 24-year-old representative from Tennessee who was to swing vote. He had a note in his pocket from his mother who said, "Be a good boy and do right by the women." So we think about, what Abigail Adams had to say. I love that, be a good boy, do what the right thing is. And it was his vote that was the 34th state, Tennessee, that ratified the 19th Amendment. When the 19th Amendment is ratified, Judge Allen had 2 days to get her name on the ballot as an independent candidate for judge. There were 3,000 members of the Businesswoman Club of Cleveland. What those women did was they were climbing scaffolding. Cleveland was a growing city here at the time, new skyscrapers. This the club members were going up the scaffolding to get the signatures necessary, over 5,000 signatures in 2 days to put Judge Allen on the ballot. And just before the election that occurred here, this is another connection between your club and that vote. So here you have the Women's Club. They met on September 21st. And you see here, after a short business meeting, Miss Elizabeth J. Hauser, again, this person that's not known, but she addresses the club after talking with the League of Women Voters earlier that day. She urged the women to vote and answered all questions. One of the things that she told the ladies here is, be careful about when you go in to request a ballot. You may not be able to do that in your own name. You may have to go under your husband's name, under Mrs. It was like a major concern that they had here about whether or not they were going to deny women who had just earned the right to vote, about whether or not they would actually be able to vote, or whether or not this would be voter suppression. So I think that's a very interesting thing of thinking about in 1920, that first time to vote, that women had to vote, this concern about voter suppression and this actually being brought over to your organization. Spoiler alert, Judge Allen wins, okay? She wins overwhelmingly, so this is her being sworn in as a judge. And 2 years later, she runs for the Ohio Supreme Court and wins as well. And boy, when this photograph is her being sworn in, and you say, first woman Supreme Court judge in the world, Supreme Court of Ohio, December 16th, 1922. You can see that this is the most diverse group of people that you see in any gathering of a room ever. Okay, not really, but here's Judge Allen right here. She had a distinguished career on the Ohio Supreme Court bench, and she also got appointed to the federal bench. First woman to be appointed to the federal bench, 1934. FDR put her into the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Distinguished career there. Always rumors that she was going to be part of the United States Supreme Court, but Roosevelt had he always wanted to have persons that went to the top flight schools, Harvard, Yale. And FDR, was like, if you didn't go to Harvard or Yale, you couldn't become a Supreme Court justice. Well, Harvard didn't allow women into their program until 1950. Okay, so kind of an arbitrary rule. Harry S. Truman considered her for the Supreme Court. This is documented from one of his supporters or close advisors, India Edwards, that Truman asked the current Supreme Court members when there was a vacancy, how would you feel about a woman serving on the Supreme Court? And they said, we really wouldn't like it because once we hear cases, we like to loosen our ties, take off our shoes and start smoking. We wouldn't feel comfortable doing that in front of a woman. So Judge Allen was denied the opportunity from which to serve on our United States Supreme Court. So when you're talking about the more things change, I wanted to show this from the American Bar Association Journal in October of 1955. This is when the Sam Shepard case is going forward, and you have the Cleveland Press that's putting very outlandish articles and whether or not Dr. Shepard was going to get a fair trial. So here we have Judge Florence Allen. I know this is hard to read, but it says she's giving a program, writing an article about fair trial in the free press. The article written immediately after that is from Judge William J. Palmer that says, how to train a lawyer to be a good husband. Unbelievable, right? Unbelievable. So Judge Allen retires from the bench in 1959. She gets senior status, so she kind of is part-time. And when she retires from the bench, she had remained the only federal circuit court, female federal circuit court judge. And I want to show this picture here. If you see later pictures of Judge Allen, you'll always see her where she never wears makeup. She doesn't wear fancy clothing. And the reason that she did that is that in the 20s, when she was on the Ohio Supreme Court bench, there was one day when she got her hair bobbed in the style of the day. And the Supreme Court literally almost had to shut down because that was all the talk of the town there was like, oh my gosh, Judge Allen bobbed her hair. And so Judge Allen became very aware of what her appearance was, and just she didn't want to create waves. Was very much concerned here about those that followed, that she didn't make any kind of mistake that was not going to lead to other women going into the path of the law. She dies in 1966, and I got to tell you, Judge Allen at the time, throughout the 20s and 30s, if you did a listing of the top 5 women in America during the 20s, 30s, and 40s, Judge Allen might have been number 1, definitely in the top 5, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, Amelia Earhart. She was there. And then she dies in 1966, and her hometown newspaper, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, made like virtually no mention of this. And Judge Allen, as a student at Western Reserve College, wrote for the Plain Dealer, okay? And they didn't do an article here on this. So one of her friends that had worked during the campaigns here for suffrage, Beta Mikason, she writes a letter to the Plain Dealer and says, what gives? And this is the Plain Dealer's response. It's like, hey, thanks for writing. And it's like, oh, I suspect the answer is that Florence Allen outlived her time, and the great bulk of our staff had very scant knowledge of her and lacked the contact with her that you and others of your generation had. I regret that this was so, but it's hard for us to undo these mistakes. The New York Times last year recognized that same mistake, in that they don't do obituaries as much for women as they do for men, and they're making a conscious effort here from which to change that. But here I love this in black and white. The Plain Dealer, like, yeah, you missed it. And I wanted to show this picture here again of the Union Chapel and of a current appellate court judge, Judge Mary Jane Trapp. In the 1970s, she was the first woman to wear a pantsuit to court in Cuyahoga County. And literally the same thing that Judge Allen faced here at the Supreme Court, the courthouse almost shut down. A pantsuit in court? Oh my God, unbelievable. This is my last slide here. And I want to show one of my mentors, who Judge Mary Cassioppo. And I don't know if people knew this, but Mary Ann used to clerk for the 9th Appellate District when she was in law school. She used to do work for the 9th Appellate District. So she did work for Judge Mary. And I worked for the 11th Appellate District. And Judge Mary, after she retired, she heard cases as a visiting judge in all 88 counties, both at the trial court level and at the Court of Appeals level. So I had the ability here to work with her as well. And so when Marianne and I, this is the two pictures of us when we were kids. So when we were dating, what Judge Cassidy would always do is take us to the Carousel Dinner Theater. And when she passed away, I think that closed down. But she would take us there on a repeated basis. It's like a thank you for us helping her on cases. And she went to Kent State, graduated from Kent State, went to law school at the University of Akron in 1945. She graduated, was the only woman in her class, one of the few women at that time from which to go to law school, and wouldn't get hired by any firms in Akron. Same thing happened to Judge Allen when after she graduated second in her class. No law firm would hire her, and she became one of the first female magistrates, one of the first women appellate court judges. But when she got married, she kept her maiden name, Cassioppo. And when she went to vote after getting married, the Board of Elections was going to deny her the right to vote because it's like, we don't have any proof that you're married. So she had to go and file an action from which to be able to vote because she kept her own name. Incredible. I mean, that may have been, in the 60s, 50s or 60s, but it's like, really? And I want to say this here to my friends here at the League of Women Voters. I really appreciate everything that you're doing here from which to enhance people's knowledge, from which to get people out to vote and exercise their right to vote intelligently. I appreciate everything that you're doing here with respect to redistricting. And I know that at times it might feel as we're on that treadmill and we're like constantly kind of like banging our head against the wall. And I just want you to know you are making a difference. And all of these, we have this rich history here in Ashtabula County of folks that fought the good fight, and succeeded and set a legacy that others have followed. And I just want to show this, like with Marianne, she'll have students come in, and I love this here of the drawings. You, me, this inspiration that's given here to young women. You can do this. And I love this whole thing of I love you. So Marianne always looks at these things when she is having a bad day. It's one of those things of like, I am making a difference. I am making a difference. And I want to say to each one of you, you are making a difference. And you may not see it immediately, but you're an inspiration to so many, so many. And keep doing what you're doing. And Godspeed. So that's all I've got here. Any questions? I probably went way over. I'm sorry. Mary, I don't know if you said something here, but you were muted. So is there anyone who has any comments or questions? I said it all, huh?
I have a question.
Dr. Levita.
Is there any way that I can get a copy of your slide deck and possibly attach it in the YouTube for a link? So what I would do is I would upload it to probably a Google Doc and then create it shareable and then have folks that they can link it and so they can see some of these images and get in there and look at it because it was kind of hard to see.
Yeah, so yeah, happy to do that. Always happy to share. This is a huge file. So I think between you and I, we can probably do this over Google Docs.
Yep.
So we'll do that. But a lot of these pictures are on a TIFF format. They're very, very high resolution. Like when I was saving this presentation, as I was creating it, it was taking the wheel, the wheel of death that was there. Yeah, I'm happy to share because it's like we are so, I think we're there of proving that we held the first women's suffrage convention. The fact that we're asking for universal rights and human rights, is that a difference without a distinction? I think we're there, but one of the things I just want to talk about here is please go to these websites here. So this Northeast Ohio Suffrage is part of the work that League of Women Voters did along with Youngstown State, Lake Erie College, and Kent State at Ashtabula. Look at the photographs that we have at this Kent website on Justice or on Judge Allen, because this has pictures of her with persons that were involved in this process. And we have names for many of these people, and they may be your relatives. They may be people here that, you may have letters, from, some family member that will be like, yeah, I remember when we went to that women's suffrage convention in 1846. Maybe it was more than a fair or a meeting, or I don't know what the difference is between a fair, a meeting, or a convention. I don't know what the difference is. I don't know. But we definitely want to share information, and I'm so blessed to have been able to work with all of you here in creating this. And what I wanted to kind of give is a snapshot, and so I know I went over, but I want to give a snapshot of where we're at here on this research so that we can continue to grow it.
No, I was just going to say you did not go over. I think we said till 8 o'clock, and it's not 8 o'clock. So if anybody has, if we have some time for questions, if anybody has a question they want to ask, or something they know that maybe wasn't brought up tonight.
I just wanted to say, very interesting. I didn't know we had as much suffrage, women's suffrage movements here in Ohio. So it's very interesting, and looking forward to looking at the slides and stuff, and digging in a little bit more.
Yeah, it's just a real neat history. And one of the things that I love about the story here that we can tell here in Northeast Ohio is it's an inclusive story. It's 100% inclusive story. And if you go to that Northeast Ohio suffrage, I just did, what I could do in 50 minutes. If you do look at that work on the Northeast Ohio suffrage, you'll be amazed. You'll just be absolutely amazed. And the thing with it here is, the people that were involved in this movement here locally, they went off to start women's suffrage societies in California, in Utah, in Georgia, out in the Wyoming area of what we talked about, in Michigan. Mary Doe gave a speech at the University of Michigan, and there was someone who helped to create the Chinese Republic constitution that allowed for women's suffrage. That was the inspiration. And so during the 1920s, you would see signs that people would say, the women of China vote, why not us? And there's a direct connection between that right to vote that occurred in the Chinese Republic and hearing a speech from someone who grew up in Conneaut, went to Edinburgh University, and ends up starting the Michigan Suffrage Association. And there's stories all over with respect to that. And I mentioned about the South Newberry Chapel. One of the persons who started that was a person by the name of Allen. I don't know if any relationship to Judge Allen, but it was Willette Allen, who created one of the first suffrage associations down south in Atlanta, Georgia. And it's like these people are forgotten to history, but they changed the world. When we're talking about increasing voting rights to allow 53% of the population to vote, there wasn't a greater expansion of voting rights that occurred ever, compared to what happened with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And you have those suffrage groups that morph into the League of Women Voters. So that's how you have someone like a Belle Sherwin, who is very much involved in the women's suffrage movement in Ohio, that becomes the second national president of the League of Women Voters. I mean, that's astounding, and that's here. Now, I want to hear from Megan Davis here, because I want to know how I did here on Dr. Battles, because Megan is truthfully our Dr. Battles expert here.
Oh, Richard, you were wonderful. Very well.
Okay, stop it.
Mary Miller Battles was just an amazing woman, but very difficult to find information on her because she was very humble. You'll see a plaque at ACMC in Ashtabula where Zonta, I believe, gave her a plaque because of her work with in the medical field. But what she went through to have a practice of her own was just truly amazing. Richard, tell about how you know, when she was in Michigan, trying to get a job after she graduated, trying to get a practice started, what she had to do.
Yeah, this is a common theme, both in law and in medicine. So when we talk about Judge Cassioppo and Judge Allen and with Dr. Battles, it didn't matter where you graduated. You could be top of your class. And you would go to seek employment and people would sort of roll their eyes. Like Judge Allen was told, you had a partner in a firm that was rocking in his chair, looked out the window and saw snowflakes and said, gee, I'd feel terrible sending a woman out to court in weather like this. That was what was said to her. Same thing with Judge Cassioppo. Judge Cassioppo was actually told after she graduated law school that there were going to be people who were going to fight against her being successful because we didn't want to have a woman practicing law in Summit County. And the same thing that happened with Dr. Battles. I mean, no matter how successful that you were, there was strength in numbers here of the women coming together. And so literally there were 20 of her fellow classmates that got together and started this. It was a free clinic. It was called, the free dispensary. And it was, providing free care to women and children here in the Detroit area. And same thing with Judge Allen. Judge Allen opened up her own shingle, put out her own shingle, and she did cases for the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. So like literally, it's like you have to work for free or nearly for free from which to prove yourself. And then it's like, oh, they know what they're doing. And I'll say this here with Judge Allen. I didn't say this in the presentation, but I think it's important, is that when we talk about that 1912 election where she was fighting for suffrage and she lost, they lost by 80,000 votes. But Ohio's home rule provision passed that allowed each city to make their own laws. And the city of East Cleveland passed a law in 1916 granting the women of East Cleveland the right to vote in presidential elections. And Judge Allen took the case for free. I think she made $50 on the case from the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association, took it all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court and won. And opened up the doors here for each city in the state of Ohio to grant women suffrage rights prior to the enactment of the 19th Amendment. That was really like one of the final straws here, is like, once you allow it where individual cities can decide the issue, that's when, the national amendment was going to pass. Sometimes you have to make those initial steps. And same thing with like, Dr. Battles, she went to specialized training. Imagine doing cataract surgery at the start of the 20th century. And she was, well known for that. She opens up her practice here in the Morrison block, in Ashtabula City, and is this renowned surgeon where people would seek her out from which to restore their vision. But it took her a number of years, for people to accept that. And I think again, how proud we are here of Ashtabula that accepted this. She had to sort of seek that refuge in an area that would accept a woman doctor, and she found it here, which is neat. It's a neat thing. I hope I did well on that. Megan, you're our expert here on Dr. Battles, so I hope I did okay on that.
You did, thank you.
All right.
Well,
Well, if there's no further
questions. I certainly thank you, Richard, for coming and doing this. We really appreciate it. And those of you that joined us that are not members of the League, we would certainly love to have you become members. You can check that out on our Facebook page or website, whatever. Jessica's in charge of that. So, but we're glad that you could all be here tonight and hopefully learn a little bit something new. So thank you.
Thank you.